Something about, something about, something about you. All girls wanna be like that. Bad girls underneath like.
Okay, there we go. Hello, everyone. On behalf of Busboys and Poets, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's discussion with authors Elaine Weiss, Bruce Levine, Kimberly Sterin, moderated by Kwesi Rollins from the Institute for Educational Leadership, about their book, Critical Conditions, Addressing Education Emergencies Through Integrated Student Supports. We can clap it up. That's what we're here for. Celebrate. If you don't know anything about us, Busboys and Poets is a community where racial and cultural connections are consciously uplifted and a space for art, culture, and politics to intentionally collide. Our Busboys and Poets servers are going to be helping us out throughout the program with putting in orders. I also want to remind you that there will be a Q&A after the discussion and a book signing after the program, and Critical Conditions is here available for purchase. Also, we're live streaming, so if you're tuning in online, you can also purchase a signed copy after the program if you check in with us at book events at busboysandpoets.com. And now a little bit about the book we'll be discussing here tonight. Our nation's public schools are under more pressure than ever to produce successful graduates, while income, racial, and geographic disparities continue to grow, and the incoming administration seems focused on privatization of dealing with those pressing challenges. A new book from the Harvard Education Press offers timely insights for educators, school leaders, and state and local policymakers on strategies to counter those inequities by supporting students, their families, and their broader communities. In Critical Conditions, Elaine Weiss, Bruce Levine, and Kimberly Sterin outline successful strategies for whole child and whole community support that can help school systems meet broader student needs in times of disruption. They take a deep look at integrated student supports, ISS, an approach to education policy and practice aligned with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in which schools focus on attending to students' basic physical, social, and emotional needs before learning occurs. Providing indispensable insight, Weiss, Levine, and Sterin demonstrate how the ISS approach is especially effective in educational contexts rocked by trauma and crisis. And now I'll pass it off to our moderator, Kwesi Rollins, Chief Program Officer at the Institute for Educational Leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. And I am Kwesi Rollins, and I am still the Chief Program Officer at the Institute for Educational Leadership, at least until tomorrow morning, right? So I do want to honor our authors by giving you a little bit of background about who they are, and then we'll go right into some questions. We know that at the time this book was written, the emergency that was focused on was primarily the pandemic, COVID. Who knew we'd have another educational emergency, equally dangerous, if not more? I'm sure we'll touch on all of those themes and how that's related. We'll also touch on the ways in which ISS, integrated student supports, and whole child strategies are still part of the answer, part of the solution, even in times like this. So with that, our authors, Elaine Weiss, has worked in education and anti-poverty policy for over 20 years, including 7 years as national coordinator of the broader, bolder approach to education at the Economic Policy Institute, and most recently, director of policy for the National Academy of Social Insurance. She's also a co-author with Paul Revelle of Broader, Bolder, and Better. Bruce Levine is an attorney and clinical professor of education policy and law at Drexel University's School of Education, where he serves as faculty director for the Education Policy Program. I could use an honorary doctorate if you don't mind considering. In addition to ISS, he has researched and written about civic education and civic literacy and the value of modernized schools for education outcomes and as community anchors. And then finally, last but not least, Kimberly Sterin is a postdoctoral fellow and director of research operations for the Joy Lab, the Justice-Oriented Youth Education Lab, great name, in the School of Education at Drexel University. Before becoming a researcher, she taught English in Montgomery County Public Schools here in Maryland for 7 years. Her research examines pathways to educational justice for historically marginalized groups through leadership, policies, and practices across the K-12 school finance and resource ecosystem. So let's give them another warm round of applause. So what you have in front of you are a panel of experts, folks who didn't just make this up, but they know a little bit about this issue, which is always good to have in leadership. So the first question is the most obvious one. What inspired this group of researchers to write Critical Conditions, and what gap in education policy and practice were you hoping to address?
So I'm going to start on this one. After the publication in the summer of 2019 of Broader, Bolder, Better, all three of us, Bruce, Kim, and I, were working in various ways and in various spaces in ISS, whole child, community schools, etc. Bruce and I were actually working with our colleague CJ, who wrote a great foreword to this book. I'll go make the first pitch for the book right now. Worth reading the foreword. Working with several communities, including two that are featured in the book, Frederick County, Virginia, and Grain Valley, Missouri, to help them identify a broader set of goals than we normally do in education. So getting beyond test scores and even getting beyond graduation rates, but helping them figure out all the different ways that they're helping students, what those could look like, what the metrics could be, strategies to track them and to report progress. And we actually, Kim, who was doing her doctorate at the time, already clearly brilliant, came into that project. And so when COVID hit all of us and those communities really in the midst of that project, a natural question for all of us is, how do we think that these communities who are already looking at such a broad range of factors in kids' lives and families' lives and school operations, how might they be dealing with COVID differently? And we started to speculate that they would probably be better equipped to deal with COVID. At the same time, I was working with a colleague who shall not remain nameless, Emma, who's here, who I've written with for a decade, who's my amazing partner in crime, better half. We were in real time looking at what was happening to schools and kids as COVID played out. And one of the things that came up, again, thanks to Emma, was this whole literature on education in emergencies. How do schools and how should schools educate maybe differently in times of crisis? And one of the things that struck us was that while this literature is pretty well known and pretty widespread in a lot of places, it was virtually unknown in this country. And we thought, well, this seems potentially applicable. So I guess I'd like Bruce, I think, will have some more to say about that.
Well, no, that was a pretty full answer, but what I would say is that all of us had experience with or knowledge of communities and schools that had community schools or were doing integrated student supports for a number of years, and we were all fans of it. And so I think we were all looking for opportunities to do more to support the growth of this model or strategy, depending on how you refer to it. So when Harvard Education Press gave us the opportunity to do something that would actually support that effort, who were we to say no? And so that would be my answer to that. The other thing I would say is that we weren't necessarily trying to address gaps. I think we were trying to change the lens through which people looked at community schools. So as Elaine referred to, in my case, I had the good fortune for a few years of directing the global and international education program in our School of Education, and in doing that, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of academics and practitioners who were involved in education in emergencies, which frankly was something I hadn't known that much about. But what I learned was this was non-governmental organizations and governments coming together to address the basic human needs of people who, whether through war, forced migration, or natural disasters or other causes, were forced to relocate to transient, temporary situations, and these organizations came together to try to meet all their needs. And one of those needs was education. And obviously the conditions in these places, and think of refugee camps, that's really what we're talking about to a large extent, whether in the Middle East or in Europe or in other places, these are really critical conditions, right, and by any definition. And so as we were talking, it just seemed interesting to think about the question of, okay, in this country we don't have the exact kinds of critical conditions that exist in these transient refugee camps, but by the same token, we have a lot of other critical conditions that are not so different, right, analogous or parallel. And so with that, we thought, how are our schools doing in addressing them? And specifically, how are these schools that are community schools or providing integrated student supports doing at addressing those kinds of critical conditions? And so one thing led to another, and we wrote the book.
Yeah, and I'll just add, hi everyone, great to see you. So I had the great fortune of my first school that I worked in was a community school in Silver Spring, Maryland, Loiterman Middle School, shout out to them, and Linkages to Learning was our main connection. So I really saw firsthand the benefits of when my students were hungry, when my students were suddenly displaced from their homes, how having that immediate support network and services helped buoy them so they could continue to come to school, continue to learn, and without that, how devastating it would be to their ability to get to school, number one, and then of course to learn. And so then when we were rocked by the pandemic, you know, we knew that this must be a scenario of where schools have these connections to supports are really going to thrive. And so when working with Bruce and then with Elaine presented this project, I was so excited, you know, to learn, especially in, which we'll share, about the communities across the country and the ways they were implementing this through this unprecedented crisis of the pandemic that was hitting everyone all at once, but having a lot of disparate impacts based on the communities.
So it's worth knowing that the Institute for Educational Leadership, my organization, is the home for the Coalition for Community Schools, which started in 1997 with a group of partners inspired by a number of people, including the grandmother of the movement, Joy Dreyfus, who coined the term full-service community schools. And so much of what we talk about today as whole child strategies, place-based strategy, integrated student supports, community schools, and many other names basically come out of all of that thinking. Yep. But for those that aren't familiar with some of that history, can you explain a little bit about what are integrated student supports?
Sure. So it started really, I would say, in the 90s. The Harlem Children's Zone is one of the biggest examples in New York, where they're connecting with social services, really seeing the school as a community hub for anything students and families might need to address those first level needs of living, food insecurity, housing insecurity, employment, and all of those. So the integrated student supports are really integrated into the fabric of the school to support that. So families don't need to go somewhere else, but they're connected to a service immediately from school. So from there, it started to grow. Different communities started to take up this model, all in kind of different approaches. The full service community schools model was more, I think, around Biden's administration, investing, and Obama with the promise zones and promise neighborhoods, and thinking about place-based strategies and how communities can really scale up and address these needs. I'll pass it to either of you if you want to jump in.
I thought that was a pretty good answer. I think one of the important things that Kwesi referred to is the fact that there's a lot of different nomenclature that goes with this, that people refer to themselves as community schools, or sometimes they talk about doing integrated student supports. I think for shorthand, a lot of times we end up using the term community schools, but it really encompasses a wide range. There's a gamut from schools that provide all kinds of services to others that provide just one or two, but they're all on the spectrum, for lack of a better term, of community schools and doing the kind of integrated supports that Kim was referring to?
So in thinking about or understanding why this is so essential to dealing with critical conditions or emergencies, I'm going to do, I guess you're not supposed to do spoilers, but spoiler alert, one of the communities that we did a lot of work with, and one that we feature very, again, Flack, my first book, Broader, Bolder, Better. I have like a real affection for this community, is in Eastern Appalachian, Kentucky. So it's a string of counties, really one of the most isolated, poor places in the country, really barely reached even by the war on poverty. It has been hit by one crisis after another in recent decades. It was the former coal center of the country. The coal industry collapsed. All the industries that came with the coal industry collapsed, one town after another. It was also, as many of you may be aware, an epicenter, if not the epicenter, of the fentanyl crisis. It just has been hit by one thing after another, and always being one of the most poor and isolated places in the country, it's also a place with the least formal education. So not only are jobs scarce, but people are not equipped to move, they're not equipped to have jobs. And so this is about as dire as it gets. What's amazing is that there are these, the first Rural Promise Neighborhood Grant was issued to an organization called Partners in Education, which has now evolved into Partners for Rural Impact. And what they're doing in Eastern Appalachian, Kentucky is so miraculous. It's really kind of hard to describe, but really digging in to meet such a broad range of needs. And I just want to give a couple of examples that are so pertinent to the crises that are going on here. So for example, a huge number of kids in this region are not being raised by their parents, whether it's because their parents are in jail, because they have addiction problems or committed a crime, whether their parents died of an overdose or something else. There are many kids being raised by aunts, uncles. I went into one school and met a family where 5 small children were being raised by a single grandma who did not have a car. So these are the kinds of situations that schools are supporting, and they have, for example, family engagement and outreach services specifically for grandparents who are raising grandchildren. They bring in artists in residence from Appalachia. One of the other problems they face is that I think most of us, and I'm going to give an anti-shout out to our vice president right now on this one, are really seeing nothing but deficits in Appalachia. And the reality is Appalachia has a rich, fabulous, diverse history. I mean, it's got an indigenous history, it has arts, it has music, it's a center of so many things. And one of the other wonderful things that these schools do is bring in local artists in residence to teach the kids that in fact, they come from a rich, impressive, interesting, diverse heritage that they should be proud of. I mean, I could just literally go on and on, as my husband will attest, having dragged him to Appalachia at least 2 times to visit, but the stuff they do is amazing. So, yeah.
So I think the key takeaway to keep in mind, so the key words obviously are integrated student supports. And so if you think about all of the various supports that kids in well-to-do communities take for granted, for example, after school, enrichment, all these other kind of things, a lot of other communities don't always have that same level of access. And so the integrated part is folks working together in the school community to kind of provide those services that the schools by themselves were not designed to take on. I'm going to ask this third question before we break. Because it strikes me that even though we're going to ask the question about defining an educational emergency, but the truth is these aren't necessarily educational emergencies. So in other words, education and the education system are not the reasons why you have the emergencies. The emergencies are happening everywhere else in the community, and educators are on the first line of defense to address them, whether they like it or not. So kids are showing up hungry. Educators know that they're not going to pay attention if they don't have a meal, so they have food. Kids are showing up in cold neighborhoods without sufficient coats, so they have, they have clothing drives. They have all these other kind of things. So the educators are dealing with the emergencies. It's not an education emergency in the sense that we might think.
Right. I mean, what I was going to say about that is, I mean, schools are really at the confluence of a lot of social ills. And really, when you think of schools, you have to think of them as connected to all the other social service systems that we have in this country. And so it's exactly right, Kwesi. You know, when we're talking about education, we're not really just talking about what goes on inside classrooms with teachers teaching students. It's dealing with all of the social ills that our society has and that really impact heavily certain communities more than others. And what's important to remember is that these kinds of schools are valuable in rural areas and urban areas, red states and blue states. And so this is one of those rare things which should not be, although it may be, a partisan type issue, right? This is something that deals with impacts that are felt throughout the social structure of our country.
Could add a little to that. I think the framing of looking at community schools as something as a response to emergencies is seeing teachers and educational staff as really those first responders. They're often the first person to see that what the child needs. One of our lessons from the book, another spoilers, is what you see is just like the tip of the iceberg of the needs, usually of students and families. And so what community schools do is when the teacher or administrator, counselor, whoever identifies this need, there's usually a community schools coordinator, which is a full-time staff member who is then, their whole role is coordinating the communications, the strategy, the approach for this network of supports. And that's what makes it different than just having a school who can reach out to the YMCA or the Boys and Girls Club or the food pantry. There's a constant network that's in action. And in the pandemic, they were able to jump in really proactively to address that need.
So, make sense? Okay, we're not off our rockers. Any questions or comments? Comments, brief questions? Questions? Please, young man. Hold on a minute, because we should mention we're live streaming, so we want everybody to hear your questions. Is it on? It's on now.
So can you tell us, specifically, for example, your school, Montgomery County, how did it meet the needs of the kids that popped up during the pandemic, different from the way other schools in Montgomery County were able to do that?
Yeah, so I actually left the classroom the year the pandemic hit. I swear I didn't know. But I left in 2019 was when I started my PhD at Drexel. So I can't answer that firsthand, but I can answer that in the ways that from the communities that we studied. And your question was, how did they address it differently, right, than schools without it? And so for example, one of the issues is technology, right? In Frederick, Virginia, their communities was called Bright Futures. And so they were able to immediately give Chromebooks. They actually set up Wi-Fi hubs in big parking lots. So not only were they giving families technology, but they were there to help them learn how to use it. So it's this deeper level of support, and they had it quicker, faster for everyone. And also because the funding was there, right? So it's that key of resources altogether.
I mean, another one that might seem like nothing, but is such a big deal that really struck us. One of the communities that we looked at is the North Side Achievement Zone in North Minneapolis, Minnesota. Very urban area, extremely poor, almost entirely African American. And this is another technology example that kind of blew us away. And again, it's when you know your families and you know their circumstances, you're able to do things that are incredible. Among the dozens of things that they sprung into action to do when COVID hit was understanding that almost all their families are living in tiny apartments in which 2, 3, or 4 people or 5 are all on a computer at the same time. So they went and delivered noise-canceling headphones to every single one of their families. And again, it might seem like nothing, But wow. I mean, this is a time when other schools we're talking to did not yet know how to get on Wi-Fi, could not figure out where their kids were, lost half their kids, couldn't find them, they had blank screens. So, I mean, the contrast was pretty dramatic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the best. Those are really two cogent examples. I think what we learned from the very beginning, COVID hit everybody, like a ton of bricks. And so no school district or community responded perfectly. But school communities that already were working together, they already had deep partnerships, they already were collaborating, had an advantage. They didn't have to lose a month and a half figuring out how to work together, but they were already working together, and then they could use their energy to be creative. And so what we discovered, aside from the 5 communities that you wrote about all over the country, folks had an advantage in creativity because they were already working together. Folks had an advantage in distributing food. Folks had advantage in doing all kinds of things. One school district, their buses had Wi-Fi, so they took their buses to the communities that didn't have good internet access, and families could connect to Wi-Fi that way and be online. So when you already are working together, keyword integrated, right, then you have an advantage. It's still imperfect because this was a ton of bricks.
Right. So I think we're actually a couple of questions ahead of where we were planning to be, but that's all right. So thinking about those examples, I think it's the partnerships more than anything else that stuck out to me that schools have. I mean, the recognition that schools cannot do it alone. So another community we looked at, and keep in mind, these are just examples. I mean, Kwesi and his organization has a much broader vision about all around the country. But the ones we looked at, another one was Salem, Massachusetts, which is an unusual community in that it works under a model called City Connects, which comes out of Boston College, very much a strong integrated student support model. But they also benefited from another program that came out of Harvard called, from the Ed Redesign Lab. They had something called Children's Cabinet. So they created something that very much mimics what you would find at a city level government, but on an informal basis, they would have city agencies meeting with social service agencies and the schools, and they got to know each other very well and develop working relationships so that even though the Children's Cabinet actually sort of fell apart before COVID, by the time COVID hit, the relationships all existed so that on day one, literally, the strong leadership that already existed in Salem was able to call on the YMCA, the food pantry of the North Shore Healthcare Coalition. There was no delay. They could immediately jump into action. And so even though all schools everywhere were trying their best to service their communities, these schools, to Kwesi's point, had a definite advantage, and they really showed that. That was one of the main things that I think came out of what we saw with the COVID experience of these schools.
And one more example is, the schools were certainly reaching out to services, but in some of the communities, since they were so well known, and during the pandemic, of course, people wanted to help, some of companies reached out to the schools because they knew of them. They were so transparent and well known. So it was a pasta company, it was in Frederick, I believe, said, we have this, we know Bright Future, so it was very easy to call and provide excess food during the pandemic. So that transparency really has value.
Oh my God, there's amazing examples, but we can go on.
Well, I mean, just to pick up on the rest of that question, though, because it seems to me there's a parallel here. We're in an interesting moment where, at least at the level of federal education policy, is the new kind of emergency or thing that we're facing. But what lessons should policymakers carry forward? I think folks are still trying to figure out what that means, especially now in an environment with low enrollment, high absenteeism, et cetera.
I mean, it could not, unfortunately, as we've talked about, everything we wrote about has not only remained super relevant, but if anything, the relevance has amplified, which not only a slang we sure did not anticipate, because we were pretty sure COVID would be the worst emergency to hit, at least during the 2 years we were writing the book. Boy, wow, that turned out to be wrong. But it's more relevant than ever now. Our bottom line, of course, is that right now, integrated student supports are still, despite the heroic efforts of folks like Kwesi, our efforts to get the word out, this is an exception rather than the norm. And this certainly hit us while we were writing the book. We had teachers, others we were talking to say, we're talking to our colleagues in other districts, and we can tell that as hard as it is here, we're doing better because we have more support. All the things that are going on that we are doing is helping us as well as helping our students. So our bottom line lesson learned to policymakers is we need to be making ISS, community schools, and certainly a whole child approach to education the norm. It really needs to be the norm in every school. I think the other thing that hit us as we started to write the book, and this is why it makes sense, and going back to what Bruce said, we understand why the education in emergencies literature didn't seem appropriate or relevant to the US, but we all know, and everybody who works in schools know, and Kwesi knows better than any of us, pretty much every school is on the front lines of dealing with some crisis or another, and that was true long before COVID. And I'm gonna actually, again, spoiler alert us into, I don't know if it's chapter 2 or chapter 3, but as Kwesi said, when we talk about education emergencies, they're not emergencies that happen in classrooms necessarily or at all. They're emergencies that walk into the classroom every day because these are part of kids' daily lives. So among the ones that we talk about in the book, we have a gun violence epidemic. And as we all know, boy, is that hitting our schools like crazy and our students. I mean, I know my daughters take it for granted that this is something they think about every time they walk through the door of a school, which is horrific. We talk about mass layoffs. We talk about the development of the Rust Belt, from going to the Steel Belt and the Auto Belt into the Rust Belt. We don't think about that as an education emergency. But when 3, 4, 5, 6 of the most prosperous states in this country over the course of 2 decades get hollowed out, when people feel despair, when heads of household no longer have jobs and become alcoholic and worse, when communities are hollowed out, schools are on the front lines of that. When opioid epidemics hit us, schools are on the front lines of that, and boy, do we see it in more than one of our schools. So the lesson is these are hitting all of our schools, usually more than one at a time. Another key lesson is we tend often to think about these as things that hit our so-called, if they do hit our schools, they hit our quote-unquote inner city schools, right? They hit our DCPSs, they hit our New York Cities, they hit our Los Angeleses. But the reality is they not only hit all of our schools, but in some ways they hit the invisible schools worse, right? The schools across the middle of the country where the towns are hollowing out, where kids have to drive an hour now because their schools have been closed. Appalachia that we talked about, the Ozarks, the Bayou, Mississippi and Louisiana, the Gulf, the border near Texas. All of these places seem invisible and are constantly dealing with crises. And of course, what we have to touch on right now is the crisis that's hitting all of us. I mean, when we have our own government targeting refugees, targeting immigrants, I have to give a quick, I work on the board of a local organization, and one of my the incredible new staff from there is here today. We work largely with immigrants, most of them from Central America. Many of them speak little or no English, and many of our families, I don't know what share, but not a small share, have at least one family member who's undocumented. During the first Trump administration, we tried to get a handle on this and felt that we were doing a decent job, but as you all don't need to imagine, this is so much worse, so much harsher, just so quick. Who can deal with this? I mean, we're providing Know Your Rights education in our ESOL classes. We're teaching 10-year-olds to use legal counsel so that they can get powers of attorney and access, God forbid, their parents' financial assets if they have to, if they come home and their parent is no longer there. I mean, this is not only, I mean, it's beyond heartbreaking, but this is true not only across the DMV, but across our whole country right now. So I think our big bottom line is, if we ever doubted that this was necessary, don't doubt it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other things that we need to think about for policymakers is, and we say this in the book, that as much as we believe there needs to be support for schools that are offering integrated student supports, this is not the answer. It's part of the solution, and that doesn't excuse us from trying to address the social ills that make these schools necessary, right? So to our policymakers, let's not be myopic about this. Let's think about how we can make different institutions work together better. I think one of the things that comes out the most to me from what we did was, again, going back to the partnerships and the collaboration, to the extent that we can help facilitate that and facilitate partnerships that are really unusual. I think one of our favorite partnerships probably relates to Frederick County, Virginia. There's one picture in the book, there's only one photo, and it's a photo of a sheriff on roller skates. And the reason that really captured us is because the relationship between the sheriff's office in Frederick and the schools was a very unusual one in our experience and what we know, right? So when we think of police and schools, we think of school resource officers helping to enforce discipline, unfortunately too often perhaps being part of the school to prison pipeline and leading to things being criminalized that should otherwise just be dealt with as internal school matters. In Frederick, we were just amazed at the broad range of things that the sheriff's department did. They were lunch buddies. They sat down with students to just hang out with them. They sponsored summer camps. They worked at the summer camps. During COVID, they were the arms and legs for the schools when it required delivering food or other supplies, mattresses, to families because they had the freedom of movement that other people did not. But the roller skates kind of captured us because it just showed this sort of easy, natural relationship. And that isn't to say that there undoubtedly wasn't friction between the police community and the community in Frederick, but it's to encourage thinking more broadly about how we can get other institutions working with the schools in ways that are productive for both the schools and the families and kids in them and the communities more broadly.
Thanks. You want to add?
Yes. Bruce kind of got to that idea of community schools is a mindset shift. And when we talk about policymakers right now, the administration is pushing school choice. It's get my child out of this failing school and this and that. But what that ignores and what is inescapable is we are all interconnected. And when you have a community school, as a teacher, and I experienced this even when I was teaching, there's a lot of, it's individual, it's my classroom, it's my kids. But it's our kids, it's our classroom. My classroom was shared with after school, our ESL classes for the parents, right? Our materials were shared. And so the community schools model is getting us to think about how we're all connected in those ripple effects.
Yeah. And I think it's a context for unusual partners to come together around a common goal. I remember being in a meeting in the rural parts of Syracuse, New York, community school meeting, Trump country. I mean, apple farms, Trump signs everywhere. We go to this meeting. I'm sitting across the table from the guy who is the captain of the emergency response team for the police department. He's basically the SWAT guy. And normally that's not the company I keep. But this guy was so fired up about the community school strategy, being part of the network in this county, being part of the solution, much like your police officer on the roller skates. And I was intrigued by that, intrigued and happy about that, because these kind of strategies where we're more focused on the solution instead of what divides us offer the most potential in times like this. So really a great observation. Well, I wanted you both to talk a little bit about So policy implies funding, obviously. And so that's of great concern now because of the attacks on the Department of Ed. But in your experience, how did folks fund their efforts?
There's a wide variety, but as we mentioned, in Berea, Kentucky, and North Minneapolis, they started with Promised Neighborhood Grants, which was under the Obama administration. And then they added and supplemented from multiple other grants, full service community school grants as well. So a lot of federal funding, also state and local level funding here in Maryland that's integrated in the blueprint for Maryland's future. And then in, for example, Salem, Massachusetts, there's additions. They've become their own entity, and even in Berea as well. So it's a fabric of funding to keep it sustainable.
A quick note, and this speaks to Bruce's point about reframing. I do think that another challenge, and these schools I think have tackled it really well, is that we think about this as extra funding rather than investment that saves us money. And one of the things that these schools recognize is that these are investments that save money. So for example, when you are not only a school, but you are also home to YMCA after-school programs, and you also have an office where social workers or therapists can come and do work in your school, and you are also able to really efficiently and effectively connect students with the preventive medical care they need. And oh my God, could I talk about how unbelievably creative they are in Eastern Appalachian, Kentucky, where it could take an hour and a half in a car that barely chugs to get to a doctor. It is unbelievable how efficient and cost-saving this is, right? The YMCA saves money, the therapist saves money, the school saves money, the system saves money, the parent saves money, the teacher, everybody is saving here. The kids aren't sick, the kids are better educated, but the school system as a whole saves tremendous money because you don't have discipline problems, you don't have grade repetition, you have much less special education. And I wanna give a huge shout out to early ed, which we did not even talk about here. But this is a cost saver too. So these are also communities that recognize that education doesn't begin when a kid turns 5 and goes into kindergarten. Again, Emma, I am looking at you for all the work that we did on this. And they invest a lot in early childhood. And one of the other things they save is getting so many kids who would be unprepared into kindergarten, hitting the ground ready to learn, rather than spending all the money they'd be spending. So part of what we really need to do is be rethinking what we spend on where we spend too much and badly, and bring that money back to the front and put it in the right way, and we'd be spending less and more wisely, as is true of so many broken systems in our country.
You know, the other thing about that is one of the first things that I learned when I started getting into the study of community schools came out of a conversation I was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which was a community that really adopted community schools thanks to Pedro Rivera, who I'm sure you probably know well, who led those schools and then went on to become the Secretary of Education in Pennsylvania. And after he left, there was a new superintendent there, and the people I was working with at the time went into those schools, and we were talking with the new superintendent. And the new superintendent, when we asked her, are you going to continue to fund these schools? She was saying, well, if I see the test scores going up and if we have a higher graduation rate, sure. And we said, well, maybe we need to change the conversation about that a bit, because this isn't really, while it's certainly ideal to be looking for those kind of metrics, this isn't only about this. This is about the overall whole child, the wellness. Is this making the community and the students and putting them in a better place? And if you look at it that way, then it becomes to the point we're making, this is an investment that is well worth making, even if it may take a while to get to those higher grades, those higher test scores. And so I think a large part of what needs to happen to continue the investment is to make sure that the conversation changes and focuses on the things that these schools can really do and make a difference in, that go beyond the normal things that we'd like to see, that No Child Left Behind really focused on. And if we can do that, I think there's an opportunity to get that funding that otherwise can be elusive.
So that's a perfect segue. I'm reminded of a story. There was a superintendent in a little town across from Columbus, Georgia called Phoenix City, Alabama. The Phoenix is spelled Phenix, and nobody can tell me why it's spelled that way. Right. But anyway, long story short, he said why they were so focused on chronic absenteeism was because empty seats don't learn. Right. And so as we think about some of the other crises, one of the aftermaths of COVID is a chronic absenteeism kind of problem across the nation, where we were finally beginning to make some headway, and then COVID, went down, and then combination of chronic absenteeism, low enrollment, and even now, the new political climate has caused a lot of kids to stay home, especially kids who are in families with, different status, legal status. There's a lot of nervousness. Mm-hmm. So what are some of that is obviously one that you're familiar with, but what are some other crises, systemic, that are worth talking about that integrated student supports can be part of the solution?
Well, I think overarching a lot of it is poverty, right? So many of the things that we talk about stem from poverty, whether that's homelessness, whether it's some of the drug problems, gun violence. You can go down the list. I think you started going down the list earlier, but we could probably spend the next 20 minutes talking about all the different things that come from that. So, I mostly would point to that. I think at this point, about half the kids in the United States can be defined as living in poverty. And as long as that's the case, and as long as their families are struggling with that, that one emergency, that crisis, which is obviously more than a temporary one, is something that's going to be an overarching problem that our schools are going to have to deal with constantly. I'd like to be optimistic and think that's going to go away sometime soon, but I'm afraid I don't think that's true.
Also, I just wanted to jump in with the example of the early childhood in the North Side Achievement Zone. They have doulas as part of their integrated student support. So that gives you an idea of how holistic, literally before the child is born, we're supporting the mother, we're supporting the families, because this approach recognizes how important that start is. But to the question about the other emergencies, something else we found from our study, and as the teacher in the group, we found that the teachers are experiencing these secondary traumas when they're supporting their students through all of the crises that they are living through. But what community schools and integrated student supports could do was to provide mental health and wellness and physical health to the teachers and administrators as well, because we know if the teachers aren't ready to give their full selves to the kids, then that learning can't happen. So it's as deeply as we're talking about the families, it's also the teachers and staff as well.
And I would tack onto that, when we think about schools, another thing that hit us, and I think, Kim knows it better than any of us, she's a teacher herself, but we tend to think pretty narrowly within schools as well. We think teachers are dealing with it, maybe principals. The reality is this is hitting everybody in a school, everyone who interacts with a child, or as we sometimes say, touches a child. Obviously counselors, social workers, but librarians are feeling this. Nurses are definitely feeling this to the extent that we still have nurses. Bus drivers are feeling it. So this is also a strategy that supports all of these folks. These are all people who are invested in kids, who deal with kids every day. Every single one of them is on the front lines. And so these are strategies that, as Kim is saying, don't only support kids and their families, they support everyone in that school ecosystem.
Yeah, this goes a little bit off of this one, but there's another emergency, and that is the conditions, the actual physical conditions in which so many kids go to school. The buildings are in horrible shape. A few years ago, in Philadelphia, they did a count, and I believe it was like 250 of the schools either needed to be basically blown up and rebuilt or rehabilitated. And through some other work I'm doing with my colleague Sean back there, who's from the international architecture firm at Perkins Eastman, we've started looking at how do we make schools, particularly community schools, better and nicer and more attractive places to go. That can help address, for example, the absenteeism issue. If students want to go to school and it's a nice place to be and spend your day, it becomes much more conducive to actually thinking about finishing your K-12 career. And so, that's another one. It's not nearly as critical as some of the other issues, but it's another part of the picture.
And as it's always nice in this pretty heavy discussion to tell happy stories, on that note, I think it's worth telling a really beautiful story about exactly how much that can matter. One of the people I met early in this work, again, was C.J. Huff, who at the time was the superintendent of Joplin, Missouri. And wow, did C.J., as you will see if you read our foreword, have a rough opening, because I think just under a year after he became superintendent, one of the biggest tornadoes ever, a Category 5, I think it's called a category, flattened a good third of Joplin, killed students, killed teachers, took out several of his schools, damaged several others. And this is what he had. Now, CJ, being CJ, who is a force of nature, to say the least, saw this as the opportunity it was, had recovery funding, and prioritized, as he should. And he said, one of the first things that I'm going to do is I'm going to build the most amazing elementary school Joplin has ever seen. I'm going to make that a place where kids want to go to school. And I'm going to make sure that the poorest kids in Joplin, who have been relegated to a school that is now going to be a dinky administrative building where the only thing that lives there is files, because that is the only thing that should be in that building, certainly not children or teachers. And there are things I'm going to do to make this place a place where kids want to go. The middle of this building is going to be a gorgeous glassed-in atrium that will be an indoor classroom. He worked with all the teachers to ask what they needed. He created beautiful pull-out spaces for kids who were having emotional issues or were disruptive, so they could still be part of the classroom without disrupting. And he put the art center in the very front, so when you walk in the front door, the first thing you see is artwork and the art room. And he said, because there are lots of kids who don't love coming to school, but every kid in this school loves art. So just these little things that seem little can make the hugest difference. So I'm actually going to say, Bruce, I don't think that's small at all. I walked in there. I'm from Montgomery County. We got some gorgeous schools. I was so jealous that my kids could not go to school in Joplin, Missouri. So I think it definitely makes a difference.
A couple of questions before we continue. If you would wait just a moment, so we've got two there.
Or which person first? Oh, right here. Okay.
Yes, black sweater, and then the young man 2 rows back. Everybody's a young man.
You named some of the institutions and organizations that you collaborate with. What about housing, which is such an intractable problem? Who are you collaborating with to get around this really sort of unsolvable problem with regard to affordable housing?
Yeah, so the Northside Achievement Zone in Minneapolis is an excellent example. During the pandemic and before and after, they collaborate with local housing authorities, so city authorities as well as nonprofit organizations, and they have helped folks get into housing, and that's one of the priorities that they were able to share, and we talk more about in the book, but I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, and so, very good question. Very good question, young lady. In places like Salem, because they had such a good feel for what was going on with the families, especially during COVID, a lot of the teachers and others would recognize that in their dealings with people online, that there were issues going on in people's housing. And so they had the connections, partly through that children's cabinet I was referring to before, but otherwise, because of their good knowledge of what was going on with their families, they would know when they could be able to make references to the appropriate housing authorities or shelters to make sure that people could be taken care of. So, I mean, it doesn't resolve the housing issues that you're talking about, obviously, but it's a way of trying to be as remedial as they can be under the circumstances, and they typically will have a better feel than a lot of other more traditional schools might.
And I want to just add one word to this that I think is so important, and that is the word trust. That is a word that we heard over and over and over, and I think it speaks very much to your question about housing. Another characteristic, another asset, another positive that these schools and organizations had that schools often lack, and especially, I gotta say it's true in schools that are in low-income communities and communities serving African American and immigrant populations, there is a massive lack of trust in way too many cases. These are schools that built trust with their families, also to the point where families were comfortable coming and talking to folks in the school. So when there was an issue, I mean, when we all think back to COVID, whatever it was, and you think you had a mental health problem, you had everything going on, and as a parent, you were just in the thick of it, and you couldn't even think straight at any moment. The other thing that these schools had was people reached out to them, and they were comfortable reaching out, and they had the right people to do it with the right language skills, with the right emotional skills. They knew exactly how to do that, and that also made addressing housing issues critical, because it is very, very hard to imagine anyone who does not trust a school really deeply being open enough and vulnerable enough to talk about their housing crisis.
And it's partly, it looks different all over the country. So there are two sides to that. One is the affordable housing, because a key contributor to a lot of absenteeism and other challenges is transience and mobility, not, the lack of affordable housing. DC is another place just like that. So that's one aspect of kind of a housing department's responsibility, but a lot of that is also driven by the broader politics in a place and how they prioritize that. The other side of that is increasingly, particularly large housing departments have an education department within them, and they are taking on a range of issues directly. So I think of King County, which is the greater Seattle, Washington area, has an education department, and they're at the collaborative table to address chronic absenteeism, because one of the key contributors to absenteeism is asthma and other kind of conditions and other medical conditions. Some of that is the responsibility of just poor conditions in apartment buildings and things like that. And so increasingly you're seeing in some places, but it goes and comes because so much of this is dependent on the current leadership, their ability to recognize it as a priority and their ability to then make it a priority to work. But that's one of the initiatives that I think of that for a long time now, and I remember literally being at a meeting and saying, why is the housing guy here? And then it's like, oh, wow, like when this is 12, 15 years ago, but that's encouraging because again, the key word here is integrated, and the more unusual partners you might imagine, the better for community. My man in the back.
Thank you. As a school leader, my question is from a policy and practice perspective. Has the different models in education, obviously charter, public, mixes like the Cristo Rey Network nationally, have they helped propel the integrated schools model, or has it taken away due to competition between those different models?
I mean, I think the short answer to that, to our knowledge, is no, they really haven't helped. And some of that is because, when you look, a lot of those schools are not really embedded in their communities. A lot of them are more of a citywide or area-wide type of institution, and so really getting to know their community is a whole different kind of animal. So at least to my knowledge, I haven't really seen that. I don't know if you have.
I mean, I would say that from a framing and policy perspective, overall they've been detrimental because the way they have tended to frame themselves is, the problem is this school, so if we take kids out of this school, it will be better. Well, kids who don't speak good English don't start speaking good English when they go to another school. Kids who are hungry are not less hungry when they go to that other school. Kids who are having emotional stuff due to family dysfunction and instability don't get more stable families. So the argument is a problem, and they also tend to, in many cases, suck funding out of the public school system, which exacerbates it. So, I mean, we could go into that in much greater detail, which, as you all have seen in the past, whatever, I could do forever, but I won't. That said, we have seen several instances here where the ISS strategy is working very successfully, and I would point to North Minneapolis as a great example where NAS, as it's the acronym, is agnostic. So they're working with regular public schools. This is the North Side Achievement Zone, which works with, I don't know, a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen schools, a bunch, all in North Minneapolis. There's regular public schools, there's public charter schools, there's Catholic schools, and they don't care. And in this case, these schools are all equally devoted to and embedded in this strategy, and that's what matters. So it could certainly, going back to Bruce's point, it can work and does work absolutely anywhere. That said, those are definitely issues.
Yeah. Question back there?
Hello. I was just curious on just the topic of community schools and you know, obviously they offer lots of wraparound services for students, you know, social, emotional, mental. But I'm wondering if with the organizations that you've looked at, is there any kind of conflicting funding whenever we're looking at those community schools and thinking about how they're doing any college and career readiness? Like, is there any conflicting, just, you know, like, are these schools more concerned with, you know, really that wraparound service? Are they also able to then also fund those and support those measures that really help those students really become college and career ready at the same time? Or maybe they're not conflicting, maybe they're able to do all of that, but, you know, is the main focus might be just that, you know, we want to make sure that these students are fed, that they are attending, that they have great living situations, but, you know, sometimes those funds then take away from the fact that we really want to make sure that these students are college and career ready once those basic needs are met.
You know, that was a great question, right? This is an old trick to buy yourself time. No, but it really was a great question. I think it looks different in different parts of the country. I mean, if you think about the whole premise that we're talking about here is that some kids and families are at a disadvantage, and that impacts on their ability to learn. So if you're hungry, if you're transient and mobile, if you don't have good health care, there was a case 15 or so years ago, Montgomery County, a kid who had an untreated abscess and died at age 12. I mean, if you don't have glasses, if you think about all of this long laundry list of impediments to learning, then you're not going to get college and career ready, right? Or if you do, there's some great stroke of luck or some other set of conditions that we can't control. But as a system, you know, you're a school leader, principal in the back. As a system, if you've got the majority of your kids facing some combination of those challenges, then that impacts on their readiness to learn, right? Their readiness to achieve. So ISS at its purest form is really addressing that issue. You still got to do good teaching and learn. Teachers still got to teach. You still got to meet the standards. You still have to do all those other things. Part of the premise is that when a teacher is no longer worried about, is the kid hungry, they can be focused on math, right? They can be focused, so that's part of the premise. So in that sense, the premise makes sense, it works. So then you get, like anything else, you get down to execution. And to the extent to which we're executing at a school building level, at a multiple school district, you know, at a school district level, at a state level, and that's where you have uneven development. You mentioned early childhood before. When the community schools movement started, early childhood wasn't really on the radar. And it wasn't until there was the impact of all this research around, you know, the impact of not reading on grade level by the third grade has on the rest of your education that folks started paying more attention to that. Most folks still don't know, which is a new fact, that it's actually early numeracy is a more important indicator of future academic success than early literacy. But we don't have a movement around early numeracy, for example. But increasingly, the school districts that have adopted this strategy are beginning to think more broadly. But again, it requires a really kind of comprehensive, integrated approach to do it well. And in the places that have had that over a period of time, they do have higher graduation rates. They do have, you know, these other kind of things that we expect to see. But then sustaining it becomes an issue. You get a new superintendent, you get a new school board, you get a new governor, you get a new mayor, and all your good work is potentially out the door. So this is the kind of the push and pull, one step forward, two steps back. aspect of the work.
And I want to give a good local example. I mean, my very direct short answer to you would be not only are these not in conflict, but in fact, they are very much closely intertwined. In other words, the whole reason, the whole basis for this is because it's virtually impossible to ensure in a lot of places that kids can be college and career ready unless we do these other things first. And as Kwesi's saying, it's virtually impossible for teachers to effectively focus on that if they are, as teachers tell us, well, I'm a teacher, but also I'm a social worker, and also I'm a nurse, and also I'm a nutritionist, and also I'm a frontline worker, and also I'm the emergency medical care provider, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also someone might need to call me in the middle of the night because they can't do their homework because there's gunshots outside. So that, of course, as you can imagine, makes college and career readiness a wee bit difficult. But just to give an example of what this looks like locally, we actually have a local school district, Montgomery County, where, while it's got a long way to go, has done a huge amount when it comes to moving in this direction. And certainly, both in terms of funding, internally we give extra funding to kids who have greater needs. We put fewer kids in those classrooms. We have a lot of early childhood. We have health clinics in some of those schools. We have a bunch of that. Montgomery County has one of the tiniest, if not the smallest, gap when it comes to graduation rates and college going between white kids, black kids, and immigrant Hispanic kids, I believe, in the whole country. And if you contrast that, and it also has massive income and wealth gaps. So it's, despite that, it's an unbelievably diverse place, and it's the 17th biggest school district in the country. It's enormous. It's bigger than lots of cities. If you contrast that with DC, which has unbelievably huge gaps, some of the bigger gaps between kids in terms of income and race, I think that that also speaks a bit, more than a bit, volumes to why this approach is so important and why focusing so hard on test scores alone is not only not a great idea, but actually actively a bad idea, and ends up punishing people for the very things that they came to school with and that they were born with.
So it ends up being a false choice, like your story of the superintendent said, well, we'll see if the scores go up and then, but how are the scores going to go up? You know, it's kind of a false choice because you can't have it both ways unless you believe in a lot of luck. She has, wait for the microphone. Was there another question back there? No? Oh, okay. She's going to make her way up here. We have time.
Hi, I'm a special education teacher at an elementary school in Montgomery County. Thank you. That was very nice. Thank you.
We'll give you a round of applause.
And I think my school is doing a really great job of kind of getting their foot in the door in terms of like approaching this model. But the really impatient part of me wants to know what teachers can be doing right now while those models are being established, and what kind of conversations can we be starting in our own schools to kind of get our admin thinking about really adopting this approach and just going straight for this model. Like, I'm impatient. I want to know what can I do right now.
Yes.
Our school leader in the group has agreed to answer that. No, I mean, you know, impatience is good. I will say this, and it's tricky because a lot of schools have a kind of, and I say schools, but I'm really talking about district as a system, have kind of a compliance mentality around special ed and IEPs and other, you know, individual learning plans. And, you know, compliance is really about the bare minimum. It's not really like this whole holistic, et cetera, approach. And so coming back even to COVID, one of the things we discovered, oh my God, kids with special needs, IEPs, et cetera, you know, caught hell during COVID. We also know that COVID just exacerbated everything. Schools had to immediately go to virtual overnight without any capacity. And then on top of that, they just did not meet the needs of special ed kids, by and large. Some places did better than others, and we're still, and you talk about trust, all of that kind of undermines the trust, and so we're still in a period of kind of rebuilding trust with those families and those students. So some of it is on the administrators in terms of the climate that they foster, right? So our principal who has his hand up, but we're going to come to him first, and then I'm going to give you a chance.
Oh, I think Kim has also.
but some of it is also the district itself and the broader policy, like how is that system set up, how is it a priority, what is the capacity building and the training that's made available to all staff, so everybody has this espoused value of inclusion. But you need more than a belief in inclusion. You actually need supports, training, right? I mean, I believe in a lot of things, but at some point I got to actually do something. So that's the gap, the bridge that we have to cross, that from belief to actual action. Here, then my man, then in the back.
Excellent question. The first thing just I would caveat and say, I never want to put more burden on teachers and staff to do beyond, because they're already doing so much and overburdened. But one of the first things that community schools do is a needs and assets assessment. So you're looking at really deeply knowing your community. What are those needs? What are the assets? What are the strengths and things that your community can do? And then you're looking to partners. But without that full-time support that the community schools and integrated student support models gives, it's hard to then implement it. But if you're looking to kind of map out, okay, where could we start? That would be the place to do it.
The only other thing I would add is PTAs are also a wonderful place to start, to the extent a lot of our schools have really great PTAs, to the extent that you've got relationships with specific parents, with any PTAs or access. This is a really good conversation to be having at a PTA, so I would encourage that.
So, Elaine, you mentioned the competition, the charter school competition for funds is, if anything, perhaps detrimental, not only not helping, but possibly detrimental to this community school idea. But what about, because I know you're familiar with this too, what about organizations, institutions all over the United States that are providing all kinds of integrated assistance to communities, but they're not schools, they're not educated schools. You know for a fact that there is a way for them sometimes to become charter schools and then become, with all the experience they already have in providing integrated help, become fantastic examples of an integrated school. Because you're working with a group that did exactly that.
Well, so that's a little different, to be fair, because it's an adult charter school in particular, so there's very little competition there. There's not like a huge clamor to become an adult charter school, as it turns out. Who knew? And really, so that is different. In theory, yes. I mean, I guess what I would say is, first of all, Kwesi may be able to answer this better than I don't think that there are actually a ton of institutions out across the U.S. providing great integrated support, but one of the strengths of this strategy, version, model, approach, whatever you want to call it, is that these schools are often partnering with a wide range. And the other piece I should say is that while the vast majority of the schools we've looked at in those places, the school is the hub, that does not have to be the case. So I'll give just an example. Bruce talked about the Education Redesign Lab, which is a program, an initiative out of the Harvard School of Education, founded by my former co-author, Paul Revel, out of exactly the same set of concerns. And his premise is that in many places, the mayor may make the most sense, because the mayor has the capacity to bring together, to coalesce all the agencies and institutions that touch children in various ways. And so in the cities where he's working, the mayor is the hub, the mayor brings together all these groups, and the school district is one of those groups that work with them. So there are many different ways to do this, and that's one of its strengths, is it really should depend on the community's various features, its demographics, its politics, its assets, its size, its geography, everything else. But again, the great strength of this is there are a million different ways to do this, and the community adapts them.
And as you make your way back, my principal has a question, and then we're going to come back up here. You're going to be this. But I will say this. There are lots of institutions that are supporting this strategy all over the country. Everybody's heard of a United Way, for example, right? So there's 75 to 100 United Ways around the country that are supporting this strategy. So that example I gave of Phoenix City, Alabama, they are part of a United Way of Chattahoochee Valley. Gives you a warm feeling inside when you say Chattahoochee. So the United Way of Chattahoochee Valley supports 6 community schools, one of which is the school in Phoenix City, Alabama. And so they're the main folks that are coordinating a lot of things. One of those other schools in that area had a full-blown medical clinic, the hospital, local hospital, medical school. I mean, so you've got Drexel, these guys are at Drexel University in Philly. UPenn is another, there are universities all over the country that are part of that effort. In Maryland, University of Maryland, in Baltimore, my alma mater, is another one that's supporting multiple schools. So you do have plenty of examples of the right institutions supporting this strategy and just kind of making it work. And that's actually a bright spot. Yes?
So my answer to you is what you're going to hear from a school leader is focus on your tier 2, tier 3 instruction, and I'll talk to somebody else, right? Yeah. And that's just not the answer. The answer is where's the partnership point, right? Yeah. So I'm the nastiest cold caller. I'll call a car dealership for a van, like, you know? And the question becomes where's the boundary of partnership? And it leads to a question, which is, one, are you willing to take a risk to make partnerships and upset leaders and make change? When I was a teacher, I didn't care. I just called people, I made deals, I then told my principal, they were happy enough to say thank you, Jesus, and move on. I also had principals tell me to get out of their way and say, how dare you? And I just told them, fire me, right? They didn't, but that's what I did, which then led me to school leadership. So if I was your school leader, I'd say, call the partner, tell me how it goes, I'll back you all the way. My question, I said the wrong thing. My question to you all, when you look at partnerships on a state, county, I have a loud voice, level, where do you find the most effective partnerships that actually create change so that teachers stay in schools?
Great question. I have my own answers. Yeah. Talk about Drexel. Talk about Joy Lab. Is that an example?
I mean, it's a great example in other ways, but not for this question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, go ahead. Please.
So, I mean, I guess my answer to that, I don't think I can generalize in any way, which may be sort of ducking the question, but because so much of this is organic and very much community-specific, kind of hyper-local, the partnerships that are going to be most effective are really going to vary. I don't know that you can sort of categorize them. I mean, certainly in a lot of places, you know, people working with food pantries, that's a key one, right? I mean, and they can be either bigger or smaller food pantries. In Salem, Massachusetts, they work with one that serves the whole North Shore area, so it's not just Salem, but it's one that's grown a lot. So I guess, you know, again, that's maybe not exactly the answer you were looking for, but I think it really does. It depends. I think it can really vary.
Like Arkansas has championed hippie, which was brought by Hillary Rodham to Arkansas, and it's on the ground in the community, and it has transformed Arkansas into youth. That's a state priority that then is local. Are there any other examples or thoughts on that kind of partnership?
So there are. So hippie is for those that don't know, is home visiting. So it's one of several national models of home visiting in the early, really zero birth to 3-year-old space. Parents as teachers is another large one that's all over the country and in various other countries as well, where like most folks don't know that probably 85% of Head Starts use the parents as teachers curriculum, because Head Starts in this country have to use a research-based curriculum, and parents as teachers as a research-based curriculum. For home visiting, things like doulas, other kinds of things. So there are, and I guess, and we'll end on a higher note at some point, we didn't want to be totally bleak, right? Because we do need to, all of us seem to be in the change businesses, as I'm known for saying. When you're in the change business, you do have to believe that change is possible, right? So that So it's not, it's, you know, there's a silver lining all the time, I think. And so there are great examples of great partnerships, and some of them are national models. California's investment in this strategy is bigger than the federal government's $3 billion invested in community school strategy, another $1.5 billion invested in early childhood transitional kindergarten for 3 and 4 year olds, et cetera. So Maryland is another, we have a representative here from Maryland through the blueprint and other things, has made a major statewide investment in the strategy. So there are examples. New Mexico, its State Department of Education has made a couple of investments to train principals, for example, in how to be a good principal in the community school. So there are examples all over the country, and then there, like I said, almost 100 United Ways, all kinds of university-assisted models around the country. So people are coming at this with all the creativity, and you know, what I most appreciate about your energy, you need people that are at the collaborative table with that energy who aren't afraid. Because in a moment like this, like you get by through creativity and courage, and that I think is what they've captured in the book, a lot of stories of creativity, courage, stick-to-itiveness, et cetera. All of that is part of the solution to this problem.
And on that note, I would say, echoing what Bruce has said and what Kwesi said and what Kim's saying, there's definitely not a specific type of partnership that is more important or less important. I mean, we can't say, like, if kids are less hungry, healthcare doesn't matter, or if they've got mental health and their housing doesn't matter. And that speaks to when states and districts prioritize, emphasize, fund, and support partnerships in general. That is the kind of policy making that works. So supporting the creativity, supporting the collaboration, whether it is for the school to partner that way, whether it is for the school to hire someone, any of those supports, basically giving the school the space and the resources to do the partnering and build the relationships it needs to build, I think is what works.
The only thing I would add to that, I mean, I've spent a decent part of my career involved in strategic partnerships, and it's not just about identifying the right partners and creating the partnerships, it's sustaining it and figuring out how to do that. And that involves communication, that involves building the trust and the relationship, and having that established way of dealing with each other, because too many partnerships die an early death for reasons that are not necessary. But unfortunately, people are busy, they don't keep up the contact the way they should, and things go by the wayside.
And in that vein, in the Northside Achievement Zone, they have family achievement coaches. And those are folks from the community that are now funded and are now in that position who care about the community pouring back in. They do ongoing grief counseling, for example. So it's not a silver bullet from outside, just do this and pay for this and everything will be rainbows. It's that flexibility and creativity that Elaine was mentioning, and allowing communities to think about what do we need, what will work for us, and grow from there.
Actually, I saw this
we had a
person
question up
right
here.
here first, and then I'll come up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Coming right to you.
Thank you. So I work with a group of teacher educators who are working to prepare our next generation of teachers to get into the field. And they're constantly talking about how overburdened they are, just like our teachers, right? But what are some, I guess, tips, tricks, anything you could suggest that we could give to our teacher educators to say, here are some skills your teachers need to know to walk into these school settings and either make those partnerships that don't exist or start those initiatives that are going to change the way their schools run, without, of course, adding one more thing to the list of things you need to accomplish each year, especially as the competencies grow and our funding goes down.
Yeah, I mean, so.
You got to say that's a really good question.
I know. Yeah, Jessica, you want to add? Sorry, could we give her the microphone? Thank you for jumping in.
It's a really good question. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica, and I'm from Maryland, where we have a statewide initiative for community schools. And so this ISS strategy is running not just in Montgomery County, but across our state. And I just want to speak to this question, and actually sort of related to the teacher question too. A couple of years ago, actually, I did some work through the, there's a place called the National Association of Family School Community Engagement, and it gave us a grant to help teacher candidates get the skills of family and community engagement, because they're not getting that. They just, the research says they don't get it anywhere in their curriculum, and they're not prepared for this kind of work going into schools, which is a little troubling, especially in Maryland, because 40% of our schools now are community schools. So our teachers are coming in without that knowledge, and our teacher educators were prepared for teaching in another era and don't, I mean, no offense, right? But don't know those skills either. So we paired teaching candidates with community school coordinators and had them shadow and had them learn those skills over the course of time so that they could start to develop and see what those things were. So they started to see, okay, well, this is what, building partnerships looks like. This is why it's important for me to build relationships with families, that, we don't rely on the parent-teacher conference, and wait for that time. Anyway, it worked really great. And we have more and more of that kind of experimentation happening. But it does require some work, but a reorientation, not just like more extra stuff, but a reorientation and actually more integrated student support framing, right? Because you're like, let's lean on this system to do more things than just support the kids and the families. Let's support our teachers too. And then the teachers, actually, once they see the family and community engagement strategy as a thing, like we're starting to do some research actually to see if that helps teacher retention. And also the community engaged kind of teaching itself. We want to see more of that. So how do we spark that? Well, we have to have teachers who know the families and the communities first, right? And then start talking about curriculum and yada, yada, yada.
Yay! So we have a question, my man here.
Yes.
Very patient, thank you, sir.
Yes, I was wondering what's the best country that has the worst, the best country that doesn't have these problems.
Good.
And also, if you had one person to read this book that would affect the country, who would you want to be?
Wow. I'll let you guys answer. That's a great question. I will say this. I'm going to let you answer that second part of the question because that's a critical one. So if you think about most of the countries that we're compared to in terms of education outcomes, when you pull out poverty as a factor, most of the education systems are pretty much on par. So poverty is a big factor in that. The other thing worth noting, and this goes to this teacher, the teacher's question, a lot of the other countries like Finland and Sweden and that we often compare ourselves to spend much more time in preparation of teachers, much more supports of teachers. They pay higher taxes, so they have a safety net, so they don't need a community school strategy because they pay higher taxes, and everybody gets those services. And they just have better supports across the board, and that's why more often than not, when we compare our scores to these other countries, it's really apples and oranges. It's not a fair comparison because the conditions are not the same. Now, in some cases, those countries do have a couple of issues around special populations that they are grappling with, and they have often come to us to find out more about integrated student supports. And usually that's, a more marginalized immigrant community that they're not accustomed, like in Sweden in particular, or Finland, they need help with doing that well. But by and large, those systems are not comparable.
So speaking of not comparable, I think one of the things that's most important to realize is we don't actually The biggest difference is we don't have a national education system, right? In theory, at least, we've got 51 state education systems. We don't even have those because really most things happen at a local level. So it's interesting. Paul and I actually wrote a piece on this years ago that Emma will remember well. One of the bits of hysteria that used to happen in this country until all of our NAEP scores went flat, and then that became our hysteria, was the NAEP scores would come out and we'd all wait, and then there would be mass argument about, oh my God, our NAEP scores are so terrible. All the kids in Sweden and Finland are gonna eat our lunch. And I'm like, first of all, there are no kids in Sweden and Finland compared to here, so there's gonna take an awful lot of them to eat anything. But B, that is not how it works. So the reality is what we should be looking at is, at least at the state level, those are completely different education systems. And to give an example, let's put Massachusetts at the top because Massachusetts is at the top. When we look at, so NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and it's a great test to use for two reasons. First of all, nobody knows who's going to get it, so no one can prepare kids for it and game the system, right? It's an actual legitimate test. It's also intensive, pretty rich. It actually gives you a pretty decent sense of what the student knows and can do. Well, if you compare NAEP kind of scores, you know, and take an international test like PISA, which is more kind of comparable, Massachusetts on PISA, for example, you know, looks like those best countries. So the average kid in Massachusetts is reading an awful like a kid in Finland, who again, although there are many, many more kids in Massachusetts even than Finland, so even Finnish kids aren't even gonna eat Massachusetts kids for lunch, right? But if you look at our worst performing states, and contrary to what you might have certain people in power tell you, Florida does not have amazing schools, their scores look like those in Romania. Okay, so we have to, right, and we don't think that any of our schools are gonna look like Romania, but guess what? They do, Florida. So things, you know, part of it is we have to think our systems are very different. We don't have a system, we have a lot of different systems.
Go online, we're all going to jail now.
We're all going to jail ahead of anyway. Kim's entire program is completely illegitimate, right? Everything we do is DEI here, people. We're dead in the water. But so this isn't one system, and what we learn from that is, if we look at Massachusetts, what are they doing well? Well, they have an amazing early childhood system. They put tons of money into education. They have a very whole child approach. They give schools extra money when they're in trouble rather than punishing them for being in trouble. And they did a really smart, about 10, 15 years ago, 20 maybe now, huge revamp that involved really, you know, again, redistributing money, having a stronger curriculum. So the whole shebang, you know, let's have a stronger curriculum, let's have higher standards, but let's put in place all the foundational pieces that are needed for many more kids to get to those. And what has Florida done? The polar opposite. And it shows. So, you know, I mean, to me, that, again, speaks volumes.
So I can't wait to hear who you're going to give this book to in the new administration.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. I thought you guys would buy me. I thought you'd buy me some time. So I'm not going to give it to one person. I mean, the truth of the matter is that what I would do, because I'm thinking grassroots support, I'm thinking that what we want is this book to sensitize people who may not be as aware about community schools and integrated student supports as some of you are or we are, and to have them understand that in their community, they would be well served by pushing for that with whoever their elected officials might be. Because Elaine's right. I mean, when it comes down to it, we really want people at the state level to be doing it. There's nobody here in Washington in particular, certainly not now, who I think is going to be particularly receptive to it, who's in charge of education, wherever that may be now. I'm not quite sure. But I think if we're going to see more support and growth, it's going to be through general recognition by a lot of people as to the value of this, and them electing people, whether it's at the school board level or at you know, slightly elevated levels above that, all the way up to governor, who are going to get behind this effort. So that's my half-hearted attempt to come up with not a single person, but a whole lot of people who I would be giving the book to. If anybody's got a better single person, you're welcome to offer
I don't
that.
know.
Yeah, I think that's the whole idea, right? It's not about an individual. It's about the team. It's about the community. It's about all together. So you read it, tell someone else, tell someone else, tell someone else, and that mindset shift, right? It's not one person. If you want to go, it's the African proverb, if you want to go far, go alone. But if you want to go, no, fast, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together, right? And so that's what we need to do.
Any other question?
I think that's all we have time for, actually.
Oh, okay. So I have time to give them one last comment? Okay, so the last question has the word hope in it. What do you hope education leaders take away from critical conditions?
I hope, and I'm gonna hijack this a little, rather than education leaders as well, but especially educators. What I hope educators take away is that you are doing amazing, amazing work every day under unbelievably difficult circumstances. We see you, we appreciate you. You are constantly getting disrespect, flack, and a lack of compensation that is unacceptable. And we hope that you understand from this how many of us see what you're doing and that you're doing it great, and that there are systems out there that can support you, and we're trying our best to make them happen, but hang in there.
And I would echo, this is, I know our title is Critical Conditions, but it is ultimately a book that is giving hope. There are 5 communities across the country, and I want to just name them all: Salem, Massachusetts, Frederick, Virginia, Green Valley, Missouri, which we should highlight more, North Minneapolis in Minnesota, and Kentucky, Berea, Kentucky. They're doing this well. They are supporting families. What made this book a joy to work on and do was the beautiful stories of how teams of people were supporting kids, supporting teachers, mental health support, physical support, housing. A beautiful story. We do have a few in-depth stories from people. Tatika Taylor in North Minneapolis was a family achievement coach who helped a parent move. They did these family achievement classes where the students and the parents were learning together, because it was all about, how do I parent? How do I see this as more than it's just us, right? It's the system. How do I learn better parenting skills alongside my child? And now she helped graduate from, I believe, her bachelor's degree. Now is working for Google. She has become more mobile in her wealth and her well-being. And so these are the kind of stories that you will get to see in this book, and it's giving hope for how to do this in more spaces.
Yeah. So I guess mine would be that my hope would be that there would be a recognition that through COVID, schools got highlighted as keys to their communities, that they are anchors, that they are civic institutions that go beyond what we think of as just school. And so I think what we hopefully illustrate here is that whether in critical conditions or in times that are not so filled with critical conditions, that these are places that we need to invest in as a society, as political leaders, and that the results that come out of doing that far exceed what we think of as the normal outcomes of schools.
So I want to thank these brilliant authors. My hope is that you remember that it's always a good idea to work together to solve problems, whether they're critical or emergencies or whatever. It's always a good idea. My second hope is that you come up here and buy all these books. They are patiently waiting for you. Let's give them a warm round of applause.
And a big thank you to Kwesi for amazing conversation and knowledge. He's the brilliant one here.
Yes. And thank you to Busboys.
I want to thank you all as well for this wonderful conversation, bringing this to our stage, and thank you all for joining us. I want to remind you also that Critical Conditions is here available for purchase. For the signing portion, I'm going to have the authors just come sit on the stage right here, and we can line up. You can come purchase your book, get in line, come greet the authors, get it signed, and we hope you have a great rest of your night. Thank you.
Since I come home, well, my body